This second group has been working on an issue that I've actually been working on for a long time myself, with a number of colleagues here at Columbia. The issue of New York City's waste management and where all this garbage goes. There's quite a lot of it, and it's been a contentious political issue in New York City for I don't know, at least 100 years, probably longer. And this next group has been working with Professor Suchman to try to come up with another approach. So if you're ready, let's begin.
Good morning. I'm Caroline Fox, and on behalf of my workshop team and our client, Global Green USA's Coalition for Resource Recovery, I'm pleased to present our development framework for managing food waste in New York City. Waste management in New York is a huge challenge. Currently, 47,000 tons of waste are produced every day in this city. Majority of this is exported to landfills in other states. 1,100 tons of this daily waste is considered commercial food waste, meaning it's produced in the retail, food services, and accommodation sectors. This waste is a heavy, dense, wet portion of the waste stream that's very difficult to manage. Our client, Global Green USA's Coalition for Resource Recovery, believes that the waste from one activity is food for another, benefiting the economy, people, and the environment. They seek to reframe the way that we talk about waste as potential resource gained rather than resource losses. Their three main organizational goals are to turn waste into assets, to close the loop on materials to reduce resource loss, and finally to reduce energy consumption and emissions. Our task was created out of these main goals. We were asked to learn the steps that developers have to go through in order to site a food waste processing facility in New York City. If this is successful, this would result in reclaiming nutrients, saving landfill space, and reducing greenhouse gases and energy consumption. If successful in New York, a project like this could serve as a model for food waste processing in other urban areas. New York's very difficult because of its population size and geography, so the idea is if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. So when we began our task, we first identified 4 main research areas that align with what the developer needs to follow in order to get these food waste processing facilities established in New York City: technology, siting and zoning, permitting and environmental review, and finally community engagement were all important steps we identified for the process. The idea is that in the end we could create a comprehensive development framework that they could follow in order to get these projects rolling. One of the first things the developer needs to do is to identify the specific technology they're going to use, because a lot of the other research areas rely on the details from the technology. We looked at specific criteria such as inputs and outputs, cost, space requirements, technological feasibility, and community response. We identified anaerobic digestion as the most feasible option for New York City at this time. This is when organic waste is broken down by microorganisms in an environment without oxygen. Basically, organic feedstock is put into the aerobic digester, it's broken down, and out comes biogas, energy, digestate, which is basically compost, and effluents. A lot of the other steps that developers have to go through during this process have to do with these effluents and the standards that are required by law for them to hit, basically. So along with technology, we looked at siting and permitting in terms of noise, odor, air emissions, and fire and explosive hazards. These are the main things that the regulations look at. In addition, permitting looks at things such as water use and runoff. Not surprisingly, a lot of community concerns come out of these same sorts of technological criteria. So noise, public health, pedestrian safety, and economic impacts and privatization of waste are all things that community groups cite when they're protesting having these facilities in their neighborhoods. So while it's great to recognize the ways that these areas align, it's also important to understand the specific steps in each category. In siting, for example, we determined that anaerobic digesters are most likely to be sited in M3 zones, which is the most heavily industrial type of manufacturing zone in the city. The purple areas on the map to my left represent M3 zones in New York City. To further complicate the fact that this is already a very small amount of space, a lot of these areas already have facilities on them, which really makes it difficult for developers to locate their facilities. In addition, they have to take into account the distance to residential areas, permissibility in the borough to have specific technologies, and finally, the number of existing waste facilities in a community district, which is basically a smaller region within a borough. So assuming that they are able to find a location, they then have to move on to the environmental review and permitting process. In the environmental review, an environmental assessment statement, or EIS, is the minimum requirement by law. Basically, it's developers have to look at their facility to determine the potential impacts of what their facility is going to produce and assess whether it is they're going to be great enough to warrant an environmental impact statement, or EIS. The impact statement is when they assess the impacts in terms of what strategies exist to mitigate the impacts of their facility on the environment. We're recommending that developers go straight to the EIS, the impact statement, for a couple of reasons. First, because it looks great in the eyes of the community if they're going above and beyond from the get-go what's required by law. Secondly, because the technology of anaerobic digester is likely to warrant an environmental impact statement anyway, so they're going to save time and money if they go right to this step. And finally, as an environmental science and policy student, I can tell you that what gets measured gets done. And so if you are assessing these impacts from the beginning, you're going to have the best benefit for the environment in the long run. While they're doing this environmental review, they also have to be undergoing the permitting process. This has two phases, construction and operations. Basically, they have to prove that they're going to meet minimum standards in each of the categories or standards we looked at earlier in both of these phases of operations and construction. So siting, zoning, permitting, and environmental review are the technical considerations that a developer has to go through when they're getting these facilities projects underway. But without effective community engagement, there's a lot of challenges that they'll hit. Community response can slow or sometimes even halt the construction of these projects, so it's very important for developers to take community concerns into account. In addition, there's the problem of distributive justice. 40% of putrescible, meaning decaying waste, is produced in Manhattan, but there are no facilities to deal with this waste in Manhattan itself. A lot of the same minority and low-income communities are being impacted by the waste facilities. So there's historical precedent for their protest. In addition, although regulations have increased in the past 10 years, they really aren't currently great enough, in our opinion. According to our research, if the developers go above and beyond what the minimum standards are, they're going to meet a lot more success in terms of their overall project if they're having effective community engagement. So with this in mind, we've developed a framework for community engagement that developers can follow as they're getting into this process. The first step is to identify stakeholders at the local, community, and even state levels. From there, they have to design an engagement approach. This consists of three components. First, informative, which refers to having project information available and readily accessible to the public at all times. Secondly, responsive, which means hosting public committee hearings and listening to community concerns. And finally is the collaborative component, which means involving stakeholders in the decision-making process itself. This is an area that's not required by any laws currently, but it's something that we identified as being particularly useful. This is the component during which creative problem solving can occur. For example, a host benefit agreement might happen where a developer offers to create a park to offset some of the damage the facility will have to a neighborhood. Finally, we emphasize that this should be an ongoing process. Community engagement should not stop when the facility has been constructed. It should be ongoing throughout the entire life of the facility. So to recap, the technical considerations that the developer has to go through are siting technology, finding a project location, applying for permits, and completing the environmental assessment. Alongside this, they have to simultaneously be doing community engagement the entire time that their project is beginning to end. So this is what our report does. It basically lists out the individual steps in each of these categories that developers will need to take. While there may be some additional things, we think that overall it's a comprehensive overview of what it's going to take to establish a waste processing facility for food waste in New York City. With this in mind, we hope that our project will help to take a bite out of the Big Apple's waste stream. Thank you. Crystal.
Hello. So how long does it take to build one of these, and what's its life cycle? Like, how long does it last?
The length of time it takes to build them really depends on the community engagement, to be honest. So it can take, and community engagement really affects how long it takes to obtain permits. So it could take a year to get all the permits you need, or it could take much longer. So that's why we really emphasize the community engagement portion of our framework.
Hi,
Hi.
Thanks for this presentation. Excellent presentation. But I have, a technical question. So 1,000 tons of food waste is not a lot. So how many of these, anaerobic digestion facilities do you need? Do you have, what is the size of these facilities?
Well, the different technologies really affect that. So it depends what the developer chooses to do. They could have, is Francis here? Do you have an idea?
Thanks for the question. So it really depends on what is the amount of waste that the developer wants to process. Like these anaerobic digesters are very scalable. So for instance, they did a feasibility study of processing food waste from the Hunts Point site, and that facility tried to do, I think, 60,000 tons for the facility. So that will be something that they did per year, sorry.
Hi, awesome job, Caroline.
Thank you.
So you said at the beginning that if it can be done in New York, it can be done anywhere. But it seems like New York actually, in some ways, is a great place to do this because there's so much food waste that you have you have a critical mass of stuff
Sure.
to put into these digesters. And I'm just wondering if you guys think that there's sort of a minimum size of a community that this would be able to be done in.
Well, right now, a lot of where anaerobic digesters are used is for farms, for example. So I think that there's a lot of examples of where it's done in small communities, but it's the being able to do it in the big places with a lot of regulation and small space that is really the greatest challenge in terms of anaerobic digestion. Daria?
Giving Tweety some exercise. So my question, again, great, is about collection. Are you envisioning doing this for restaurants or also households? And if so, how are you going to get the food waste from those people?
Sure. So our project we were tasked to look specifically at commercial food waste that can be easily source separated, meaning that at its port of origin, they're just separating it out and diverting it from the main waste stream, which helps. It wasn't a part of our task to look at how the logistics of that were going to happen. We were focused more on the actual getting the facilities established. But that's definitely something that will need to be taken care of as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I should mention one point I would add to the presentation, which is that the anaerobic digester is for urban areas. The way this is done in rural areas is called a compost heap. And so, in fact, in small communities, where you can do these things, spreading it on your land and then using it for fertilizer for your crops and so forth. So that's, in a sense, the anaerobic digester idea is to take the same concept and work it for cities. And I think it's one of those things that makes a lot of sense in many cities. The problem in New York, of course, is the price of real estate. These digesters will be competing with you for apartments. And, you make more money on the apartments, I think. In any event, very nice presentation and really wonderful job, great group. And let's take a brief break and then resume.